You're going there again? My voice cracked, and I didn't bother hiding my irritation. There? Oh, Brian. Not this again. Jessica rolled her eyes, crossing her arms over her chest. She stood in the middle of the kitchen, her bag already packed, and her car keys lay on the table next to her phone. How many more times are you going on one of these nature trips, Jess? I slapped my palm on the table. It's the same every time. Friday night, you pack your things and disappear for the whole weekend. And I'm still supposed to believe you're out there hiking alone and meditating? She raised her head, her eyes shooting daggers at me. It's the only place where I can just be myself. Without it, I'd suffocate. Do you understand that? Without it or without someone? I stepped closer, feeling the tension rise in the room. Maybe you should tell me who this nature guru is that inspires you so much? You're unbearable. She turned to the door, ready to leave. Don't go. I grabbed her wrist but let go immediately, feeling her resistance. Jessica, can't we just talk? Tell me why you keep running away. I'm not running. She spun around, her face flushed with anger. You've turned my life into a cage, Brian. I can't breathe around you. You want to control everything I do and still pretend like everything's fine. Her words hit me like a hammer on glass. We both knew that wasn't true, or at least, I wanted to believe it wasn't. If it's so bad for you, why are you still here? My voice was barely a whisper now. Jessica froze, her face softened for just a moment. Because I was hoping you'd understand. Understand what? That you need someone else? I almost shouted, and her face went pale. I'm not having this conversation. She grabbed her keys and headed for the door. You know what, go. I didn't try to stop her. But when you come back, we're having a serious talk. Or don't come back at all. The door slammed behind her. Left in silence, I listened to the sound of her car starting and driving off. This wasn't her first escape, but something inside me told me it might be the last. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, staring at her empty coffee cup on the table, unable to shake the feeling that something had finally broken beyond repair. When the sound of her car faded into the distance, silence wrapped around the house like a heavy blanket. I tried convincing myself that this wasn't as bad as it seemed, that every couple had their problems. But something about her tone, her words, spoken so coldly, made me doubt that. Cage, her voice echoed in my head. I always thought our life was a fortress, but for her, it had become a prison. Why? Had I done something wrong? We'd always been a team, always supported each other. Now, I felt like we were two ships drifting apart. Jessica had been my anchor, my steady point in this chaotic world, and now she felt like a stranger. I wandered through the house, trying to occupy myself, washing dishes, wiping the table, even turning on the TV to drown out my thoughts. But everything reminded me of her. The book she left on the armchair, the scarf hanging by the door, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. She'll come back. She always comes back. But each time, her absences grew longer, and her returns colder. I checked the clock. It was almost 10 at night when I heard the sound of her car pulling into the driveway. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know what I'd say, but I knew I couldn't stay silent. Jessica walked in, carefully closing the door behind her. Her face looked tired, but her eyes were guarded. She saw that I'd been waiting. You're still here, she said it like she'd expected me to be gone. Of course I'm here. This is my home. My voice was calm, but inside, I was boiling. She set her bag down and shrugged off her coat. Brian, I'm exhausted. Can we talk tomorrow? No, we can't. I stepped closer. Jessica, what's happening to us? Why do I feel like I'm losing you more every time you leave? She sighed and rubbed her temples, as if preparing for a difficult conversation. Brian, I don't know what you want me to say. I want the truth. My voice cracked. Are you really going out there to be alone? Or is there someone else? Her eyes widened before she quickly looked away. How can you even say that? You think I'm... She stopped, searching for the right words. It hurts to hear that. And it hurts not knowing what's happening to my wife. I pressed my hands to my chest, trying to steady my breathing. I'm not saying it's true, but you leave without explanation. You come back like nothing happened. You don't understand, her voice softened. That place, it helps me find myself. I feel like I'm losing myself, Brian. And it's not about you. It's me. Not about me? I let out a bitter laugh. How can you say that when every time you leave, it's like a knife in my back? She lowered her head. For a moment, the room was silent before she quietly said, I'm sorry. I don't want you to feel this way. I really do want us to be okay. Her words sounded sincere, but they didn't comfort me. Something in her tone, in her posture, everything screamed that she was hiding the truth. She wanted to smooth things over, but I knew this wound would only grow deeper. I want to believe you, Jessica, I said, looking directly into her eyes. But something's wrong. You can pretend all you want, but I can feel it. She nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. I'll try, Brian. I'll really try. Just give me time. Time. I stared at her coldly. You're asking for time, but you can't even explain why. She froze, searching for words but finding none. Only silence hung between us, heavy and oppressive, like a wall we couldn't break through. Don't want to talk? Fine. I clenched my teeth, suppressing the anger building inside me. But don't expect this to just go away. I stepped away, leaving her standing in the middle of the room. The silence of the house now felt deafening, the tension in the air almost tangible. Her eyes followed me, but I avoided looking at her. We were in the same house, but we felt like strangers, miles apart. I walked to the living room window and stared out at the dark street. I knew she was still standing behind me, but I didn't plan to continue the conversation. Let her think. Let her feel the same cold emptiness I felt. Brian. Her voice was quiet, but I didn't respond. I heard her sigh heavily before she slowly walked toward the bedroom. Her footsteps faded, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Inside, anger and disappointment burned, but I forced myself to stay composed. The morning began with a heavy feeling, as if the night had only made everything worse. Jessica was already in the kitchen, her face glowing with an unfamiliar softness. She was setting the table, a scene that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. Good morning, her voice was warm, like the freshly brewed coffee she placed in front of me. I stared at the cup, then at her. Did something change? She frowned, her hands pausing over a plate. What do you mean? You're making breakfast. Smiling, acting like last night's conversation didn't happen. I fixed her with a steady gaze, trying to catch even a shadow of an emotion. I just want us to be okay, Brian. She sat across from me, her voice quiet and slightly apologetic. Last night was tense. I thought we should start the day differently. Tense? That's putting it mildly, I scoffed. You said you needed time to figure yourself out. And what? You resolved everything overnight? She looked away, but the smile didn't leave her face. Sometimes mornings bring new perspectives. I took a sip of coffee, trying to hide my anger. Her sudden shift in behavior felt too staged, like she had rehearsed every move. After breakfast, Jessica went out to the store. She mentioned wanting to make something special for dinner. I nodded, letting her leave without a comment, but inside, suspicion gnawed at me. I started searching the house. It felt dirty, but I couldn't stop myself. Her bag, left in the hallway, was my first target. Among the usual items, wallet, phone, makeup bag, I found a small scrap of paper. An address, written in her neat handwriting. I unfolded the paper and stared at the lines. The address looked familiar, but I couldn't immediately place it. Maybe it's just another store or park, I thought. But unease was already spreading through my chest. By evening, Jessica returned home with bags full of groceries. She was smiling, her movements light, almost cheerful. I thought we could have pasta tonight, she said, placing the bags on the kitchen counter. The one you like. Pasta, I murmured, watching her closely. Sounds good. She looked at me, her gaze lingering a moment longer than usual. Brian, you're acting strange. I'm acting strange? I laughed dryly. You're the one who's suddenly decided to be the perfect wife. What? Her face twisted in surprise. Are you serious? I'm just trying to make our lives better. Is that so bad? Better for whom? Us or you? I leaned back in my chair, studying her. Do you think I don't notice how you're trying to smooth things over? She froze, her hands gripping the edge of the table. You're doing it again. Why can't you just accept that I'm trying? Because this isn't like you, Jessica. You weren't like this. And now you've suddenly decided to be flawless, as if that'll fix everything. Her eyes glistened, but she quickly turned away. I just want you to be happy. Happy? I stood, feeling the tension creeping into every corner of the room. This isn't happiness, Jessica. It's a performance. She turned to face me, her expression pale. Why are you doing this to me? Because I can feel the lies, I nearly shouted. You can try to hide them behind smiles and pasta, but they're still here. Between us. She didn't reply. She just turned away and began unpacking the groceries, her shoulders slumping. We spent the evening in silence. She cooked dinner but barely ate. We sat at the table, each lost in our own thoughts. When she went to bed, I picked up the scrap of paper with the address again. Typing it into a search engine, I discovered it was near a park she often visited. The address belonged to a small art pavilion that hosted events for photographers and artists. I remembered her mentioning wanting to learn photography, but why had she never told me about specific classes? Why was this written on a scrap of paper and not discussed with me? I opened her laptop. It was still unlocked, as it had always been. This was my one chance. Her email inbox looked suspiciously clean. The latest messages were over a month old, even though I knew she corresponded with colleagues daily. Everything about it seemed off. In her browser bookmarks, I found a site listing events at the pavilion. Among them was a photography course held every Friday. The next morning, over coffee, I decided to confront her again. Jessica, I began, trying to keep my voice calm. Are you taking a photography class? Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I saw confusion. Then she nodded. Yes. I told you I wanted to learn photography. You didn't mention classes, I said. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't think it was important. She quickly regained her usual composure. It's just a hobby, Brian. A hobby? I smirked. And driving there every week, hiding it from me, that's part of the hobby too? She sighed, her shoulders slumping. Brian, I don't want to fight again. I'm just trying to find myself. That's all. Find yourself? Or find something else? My words came out harsher than I intended. She looked away, and I saw tears forming in her eyes. You don't understand. Then explain it to me. I shouted. Explain what's going on. She rose from the table and approached me, her hand brushing against mine. I really want us to be okay. Please, just trust me. Her words sounded sincere, but something about them didn't sit right. Her gaze, her tone. It all felt too perfect, too rehearsed. When she went to the bedroom, I stayed at the table, staring at my untouched coffee. I had more questions than answers, and I knew that address would be my next destination. If Jessica wouldn't tell me the truth, I would find it myself. Friday came faster than I expected. All day, I waited for evening to arrive so I could go to that address. As usual, Jessica said she was heading to the park to work on her photography. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral, though inside I was boiling. When she left, I followed her. Keeping a safe distance, I made sure not to draw attention. Her car pulled into the lot of a small building with a sign that read, Creative Space, Exhibitions and Classes. She went inside, and I waited. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like the entire neighborhood could hear it. After a few minutes, I stepped out of my car and headed toward the door. Inside, the place was quiet, save for the occasional voices and the clicks of cameras. I walked down a hallway until I found a room where laughter echoed softly. When I peeked inside, my vision blurred with rage. Jessica stood with her back to me, and in front of her was a tall man with casually styled hair, holding a camera. He was touching her face, brushing a strand of hair aside while whispering something to her. They laughed. Too close. Too comfortable. Jessica! My voice boomed louder than I intended. She spun around, her face draining of color. The man stepped back, looking startled. Brian, what are you doing here? Her voice trembled, laced with more fear than surprise. Me? I took a step forward. I should be asking what you're doing here. Or, more accurately, with him. The man raised his hands defensively. Look, This isn't what it looks like. Shut up. I shot him a glare. This has nothing to do with you. I turned back to Jessica. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. So these are your photography classes? I spat the words with venom. You come here every Friday to spend time with him? Brian, please, it's not like that. She stepped toward me, but I pulled away. Not like that? I laughed bitterly, devoid of any humor. Do you think I'm an idiot? That I'll believe another one of your lies? She stood there in silence, tears welling in her eyes. The man quietly edged toward the door, clearly realizing his presence was making things worse. Do you have anything to say? I took a step closer, practically daring her to respond. Maybe now, for once, you'll tell me the truth? Jessica lowered her head, her shoulders slumping. Brian, I don't know what to say. Oh, I know what to say. I clenched my fists, feeling the fury surge through me. You're a liar, a selfish, pathetic. Stop, she snapped, lifting her head. Her eyes burned with desperation. Yes, I lied. Yes, I spent time with him. But you never even tried to understand me. Understand? I stepped closer, locking eyes with her. I tried, but it seems you were too busy with your classes to notice. Her words sounded like excuses, but I wasn't interested in hearing them. All I could see were the shattered pieces of our marriage, broken by her actions. Yet instead of storming out, I stayed. Maybe it was the need to understand where it all went wrong. Or perhaps I just wanted to hear the truth from her one last time. Why, Jessica? My voice was low, but sharp. Why did you do this? She looked at me, her face filled with confusion. I don't know, she finally said, her voice shaking. It just happened. Happened? I repeated, disbelief dripping from my tone. That's all you can say? It just happened? Brian, I can't explain it in a way that you'll understand. It wasn't about you. Not about me. I interrupted, my anger boiling over. Everything we've built, everything we've been through, and it's not about me? Then what is it about, Jessica? Your fantasies of finding yourself? Or the fact that I don't measure up to your expectations anymore? She turned away, her shoulders shaking as she tried to hold back tears. I felt lost, she finally whispered. Like I was stuck? Lost? I laughed coldly. And your solution was to find comfort in another man's arms? She turned back to me, tears streaming down her face. It was a mistake. I know that. But in that moment, I felt alive again. And what exactly did you feel, Jessica? I stepped closer, my gaze unyielding. Freedom? Excitement? Or just the thrill of someone else looking at you in a way I no longer can? No, she exclaimed. It wasn't like that. Then explain it to me. I crossed my arms. Tell me how it started. She hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. It started at the classes, she admitted at last. He was the instructor. At first, it was just conversations. About photography, about life. He listened to me, Brian. I felt like I could be myself. And with me, you couldn't? I asked, feeling something inside me crack. You were there, her voice wavered, but you weren't present. You were always busy, wrapped up in your own world. I tried to reach out to you, but you didn't notice. Don't you dare blame me, Jessica, I said coldly, staring her down. You made your choice, and now you're trying to justify it by saying I was busy? She covered her face with her hands, her sobs muffled. I know it was wrong, she muttered through her tears, but at that moment, I felt like I was drowning. And now? Do you feel better? I asked sharply. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with pain. No, I've only destroyed everything we had. Yes, you have, I agreed. And it's hard to believe you regret it. She reached for me, her hand brushing against mine. I do regret it. Brian, I don't want it to end like this. And how exactly did you imagine it would end? I pulled away. That I'd understand, forgive, and we'd go back to how things were? I don't know, she whispered. I just want a chance to make it right. To make it right? I shook my head. This isn't something you can fix, Jessica. On the drive home, I stayed silent. Jessica tried to speak, repeating, "Let me explain." But I ignored her, gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing keeping me grounded. When we got home, she tried again. "Brian, please." Her voice was almost pleading. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "I didn't mean for it?" I cut her off, turning to her with a cold smile. "You didn't mean it, but you still did it." When the conversation ended, I sat alone in the living room. Jessica retreated to the bedroom, but her presence lingered like a shadow. Her words echoed in my head. Maybe I had missed her struggles. Maybe I had been too absorbed in my own world. But that didn't excuse her betrayal. Now I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to forgive her or try to piece together what was broken. But before I left, I would make sure she fully understood the weight of her choices. Right after our last argument, I realized this night marked the point of no return. Something shifted inside me. I no longer felt the familiar ache. Instead, a cold clarity washed over me, as if a bright light illuminated the steps I needed to take next. Jessica wanted freedom. She would get it, but it would be a bitter kind of freedom, leaving her with nothing. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Jessica was still asleep, curled up on our bed. I stood over her for a long moment, trying to pinpoint what I felt. Anger? No, it was something else. Contempt. She had destroyed everything we'd built together, and I no longer wanted to be part of her life. I went downstairs to my office, my mind already racing. My first step was to check our finances. Opening my laptop, I logged into our joint account. It was just as I expected, full, but no longer truly ours. "This is easy to fix," I muttered under my breath. I transferred the funds to a separate account. It was a dirty move, but I no longer felt any moral restrictions. Everything I did now felt justified. Later that afternoon, I told Jessica I needed to run some errands. She nodded, avoiding eye contact. It had become her habit in recent days, silence and a deliberate effort to fade into the background. "You don't mind, do you?" I asked, testing her reaction. "Of course not," she replied quietly. "I was thinking of making dinner." "Great," I said, though her voice carried an edge of unease. My destination was clear: to find an attorney who would help me in this on my terms. The lawyer's office was downtown. When I walked in, I was greeted by a man in his 40s, his demeanor professionally detached. "Mr. Wilson, how can I assist you?" he asked, gesturing toward a chair. "I need a divorce," I said bluntly, "and I want to make sure my wife walks away with as little as possible." His eyebrows raised slightly, but he nodded. "We can make that happen. Tell me more about your situation." I explained everything: Jessica's infidelity, our shared account, the house I had purchased with my own money. He listened intently, taking notes as I spoke. "Your case isn't unique," he said when I finished. "We can use the infidelity as a key factor in the divorce proceedings. Judges rarely side with the unfaithful." "Perfect," I replied. "As for your house," he continued, "you mentioned it was entirely paid for by you?" "Yes." "Then the odds of keeping it in your name are high, especially if your wife has no proof of financial contribution." His words were music to my ears. "We'll begin the process immediately," he added. "But I should warn you, she may try to fight. Are you prepared for that?" "I'm ready," I said firmly. When I returned home, Jessica had indeed prepared dinner. She greeted me at the door with a hesitant smile. "You're early," she said, as if trying to gauge my mood. "Yeah," I replied curtly. We sat at the table, and she began talking about mundane things: the weather, her plans for the weekend. I listened, but my mind was elsewhere. Finally, I couldn't hold back any longer. "Jessica," I interrupted, "we need to talk." She froze, her fork hovering over her plate. "About what?" Her voice was barely audible. "Us," I said. She slowly set down her fork and looked at me. Her eyes were a mix of fear and anticipation. "I'm filing for divorce," I said plainly, without hesitation. Her face turned pale. For a moment, she seemed unable to speak. You're serious?" she finally asked. "More than serious," I replied. "You made this choice, Jessica." "I didn't choose this." She stood up abruptly, her voice trembling. "It was a mistake, Brian. A mistake I'm willing to fix." "A mistake?" I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow. You think I can just forget what you did? I don't know, she sobbed, her voice filled with desperation, but I'm asking you to try. No, I stood, towering over her. I've turned a blind eye for too long. This is the end. She stepped closer, her hands shaking. Brian, please, she begged. I don't want to lose you. You lost me the moment you decided to betray us, I said, holding her gaze steady. The rest of the night passed in silence. Jessica cried in the bedroom, but I didn't go to her. I stayed in the living room, finishing the last of my preparations. The next morning, I sent the finalized documents to the lawyer. The wheels were in motion, and there was no turning back. I stared at the empty coffee cup in front of me, feeling a strange mix of relief and anger. This wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of her new life, the freedom she had craved so desperately. All I wanted now was for her to understand the full weight of her choices and to feel the emptiness left in the wake of everything she had destroyed. The court hearing was over faster than I had expected. Everything felt mechanical, like I was watching a scene from someone else's life. Jessica sat across from me, her face pale but composed, trying to maintain her dignity. My attorney represented me with cold determination. All the evidence was on my side. The house had been purchased with my money, our accounts had long been separated, and her infidelity was the key argument in my favor. When the judge delivered the ruling, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The house and the majority of the assets will remain with the plaintiff, the judge's voice echoed through the room. The defendant will receive minimal support, sufficient for a transitional period. Jessica closed her eyes and exhaled deeply. I saw her hands clench into fists, but she didn't say a word. After the hearing, she approached me. It was the first time she had looked me in the eye in weeks. I want to apologize, she began, her voice trembling, for everything. I looked at her, but this time, I felt neither anger nor pain, only cold indifference. You've already apologized, I replied, but it doesn't matter anymore. She lowered her gaze, and for a moment, I saw a single tear roll down her cheek. I'm going to stay with my parents, she said quietly. I think it's best for both of us. Maybe it is, I nodded. She hesitated for a moment, as if wanting to say something more, but then thought better of it. She turned and walked away. As her car disappeared around the corner, I stood at the window, staring at the empty street. The house, which once felt too big for the two of us, now seemed enormous, cold, and hollow. Yet, strangely, it didn't bother me. I had begun a new life. Every trace of her presence was gone. Her clothes, her books, the little trinkets that once made this house ours. Now it was mine. Weeks passed. I returned to work and started reconnecting with friends I hadn't seen in ages. Each day, I felt the air grow a little lighter, a little easier to breathe. Sometimes, I thought about Jessica, about what might have been if she had come to me sooner, before everything fell apart. But those thoughts were fleeting. I understood that our past was just that, past. There was no sense in revisiting it. One morning, sitting on the terrace with a cup of coffee, I realized something had changed. The pain was gone. The anger had dissipated. All that remained was clarity. Jessica had wanted freedom, and she had gotten it. I had wanted justice, and I had achieved it. Now, none of it mattered anymore. My life was moving forward, and I was ready to embrace it. The period of my life with Jessica had come to an end. The chapter was closed, the final point firmly placed. This time, I knew it would stay there forever.